my friend and sister in St. Benedict, Sister Judith Valente. She's not physically with us today because her husband, Charlie, has been seriously ill. I'm grateful she was able to pre-record her presentation for us, as her words always help me see more clearly and live more deeply. I can't imagine anyone more qualified to speak on loving the world, the art and vocation of communication. For Judy's true vocation is communication, and communication is her art. She has spent her entire adult life growing into and perfecting both for the sake of the world. Judy is an award-winning author, poet, essayist, and journalist. She is a Benedictine oblate of Mount St. Scholastica Monastery in Atchison, Kansas, and has committed to living Benedictine spirituality in the monastery of the world, a commitment she takes very seriously. A former staff writer for the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, Judy was also an on-air correspondent covering faith and values for Religion and Ethics Newsweekly on national PBS-TV for many years. She continues to write for U.S. Catholic and National Catholic Reporter. A poet at heart, along the way, Judy got her MFA in creative writing and has published 2 collections of her poetry. She encountered Benedictine spirituality and did a 180, reinventing her career to follow the call in her heart. Since, she has written several spirituality books, the most recent being How to Be, a Monk and a Journalist Reflect on Living and Dying, Purpose and Prayer, Forgiveness and Friendship, which she co-authored with Trappist monk Brother Paul Cannon. She is a sought-after retreat leader and speaker on such subjects as living a more contemplative life, discovering inner wisdom through poetry, and finding meaning in work. Judy has also mastered technology as a communications tool. She is a blogger. You can find her blog and her books at judithvalente.com. And she regularly adds beauty and grace to Facebook. Over the years, Judy has won numerous awards for her reporting and writing, and most recently, she received an honorary doctorate from her alma mater, St. Peter's University in New Jersey, last May, for contributions to journalism, poetry, and the spiritual lives of others. I trust you will find in her words inspiration for your heart, as well as wisdom for fulfilling your role as communicators for women religious. Judy knows our profession. She has given her life to speaking truth, to this sacred trust that we share as communicators. And after the recording, there will be some time to discuss some of the concepts in her talk. So Judy, I welcome you, and I'm grateful you're here to share with us.
Good afternoon to everyone. On this first full day of your conference, I hope that you are enjoying both meaningful fellowship and stimulating conversation. I very much would have liked to be with you in person, but due to unforeseen circumstances, that was not possible this time. Perhaps we'll get together in the future. Still, I'm honored to be invited to share a few words with you virtually today. I speak not as a person of particular expertise, but as a fellow traveler with all of you. In preparing for today, I reflected deeply on what I could impart that might be of some small value to you. Perhaps the best gift that I can offer is to affirm the importance of the work that you do. You not only communicate the good news, you communicate news that is good. A rarity in our increasingly fractious media environment and conflict-ridden society. In a recent article in Global Sisters Report, Sister Nancy Sylvester of the Institute for Communal Contemplation and Dialogue offered this interesting observation. She wrote, "Sadly, too much of what is broadcast shares the violence, the wars, the political rivalry, the devastating effects of climate change, and the suffering of our world. Too often we get used to what we see and hear, and we forget that there is so much more to look at or know that can give us a new perspective. You, in your important work, give us much more to look at, and you often give us a new perspective." In that regard, I'd like to share a poem that speaks to me of our common vocation. It was written by one of my favorite poets, and perhaps one of yours too, Mary Oliver. This is an excerpt from her poem, To Begin With, The Sweetgrass. Look and look again. The world is not just a thrill for the eyes. It's more than bones. It's more than the delicate wrist with its personal pulse. It's more than the beating of a single heart. It's praising. It's giving until the giving feels like receiving. You have a life. Just imagine that. You have this day and maybe another and still another. And if you have not been enchanted by this adventure, your life, what would do for you? And what do I risk to tell you this, which is all I know? Love yourself, then forget it, then love the world. I find myself these days increasingly turning to poetry to help me to see in new ways, because so often it is in poems that spur us to unspoken possibilities and perspectives. In another of her poems, Mary Oliver says, "My work is loving the world." I have often thought of that as an apt description of the art of communication. For what is communication but a form of communion, of companioning one another? It takes us back to the Latin roots of the word companion, cum panis, with bread. To do the work that we do is to break bread with others. Or as Mary Oliver put it so simply, our work is loving the world. This doesn't mean that at times our work is not a struggle. Sometimes as communicators, we might feel less like our work is loving the world and more like the humorist Carl Hyacin, whose philosophy is assume the worst. Assuming the worst, Hyacin said, is the best and most promising course in life. It will keep despair and disillusionment at bay and frees us to be pleasantly surprised when the worst doesn't happen. Looking back at the events of just the past year, a senseless war in Ukraine, the vitriolic fallout from the Supreme Court's overturning of Roe v. Wade, a mass shooting of people of color in a Buffalo supermarket, the slaughter of school children and their teachers at Robb Elementary School, the death by suffocation of dozens of migrants packed into a locked trailer on the southern border, the drip, drip, drip of disturbing news out of the January 6th investigating committee, the ongoing pandemic, and the violent attacks on our institutions, from our churches to the FBI. All of it begs the question, as a society, as a nation, what have we become? I too admit at times to giving in to despair, the kind of despair that peace activist John Paul Lederach expressed in an essay he wrote for the Mennonite magazine. Lederach says watching the news became so oppressive for him that at one point he turned off the sound on the screen and simply looked at the faces. With rare exception, I saw suffering, Lederach writes. Some of the suffering took a few people toward slower inner reflection. Some of it took the many toward rage. A sad heart climbed into my throat, looking for refuge. My tongue went Zechariah. My tongue went Zechariah. We, however, did not become communicators to let our pens, or perhaps more precisely, our computer keys, become silent like Zechariah. Our profession is a sacred trust to speak the truth. All of you play an important role in this sacred trust. We are in a situation today where a large number of people lack trust in our institutions, from the government to our churches. They mock the very term expert. They see conspiracies everywhere. There still isn't even consensus on who won the last presidential election 2 years ago. But you know, the one place where there is consensus, there is near universal respect for our women religious. A 2015 Hilton Foundation survey found an overwhelming 73% of those surveyed had a favorable view of Catholic sisters, and 35% said they hold a very favorable view of religious sisters. Earlier this month, the US bishops released a report on their recent synod. Among ongoing concerns from the laity about the clergy sex abuse scandal, racism, and obstacles to community building, one bright light, the one bright light, was the deep appreciation people expressed for the powerful witness of women religious who have consistently led the way in carrying out the mission of the church. Is this report such a surprise? As the Hilton Foundation researchers found back in 2015, worldwide Catholic sisters work to educate children, provide care to those in need, promote peace, and advocate for justice while standing alongside individuals experiencing oppression. Their work, services, and partnerships with the church span over 100 countries, 250,000 Catholic schools, 50,000 social service organizations, 20,000 healthcare facilities, and 16,000 elderly care facilities. Or, as Sarah Bradley, a young woman in the Nuns and Nuns Network, expressed it so well, Catholic sisters have a history of making countercultural choices, of taking risks for a cause, of loving the world into a more just future. There again, those words, loving the world. It seems clear that when people encounter women religious, They trust that they will find individuals who are both spiritually mature and authentically compassionate. This is why what you do as their communicators is so crucial. The stories of women religious have never been more necessary in a world hungering for the bread of good news. You are called to be channelers of their stories. But first, like all good communicators, you and I, all of us, must become good listeners. Or as Saint Benedict urges in his famous rule for monastics, we must learn to listen with the ear of the heart. Pope Francis offers this simple little formula to remind us how to become careful listeners and better communicators. Talk little, he says, listen a lot, say just enough. That doesn't mean our job is simple. We are living in an age of momentous change that affects where we get our news, how we get it, and from whom we get it. Ours has been described as a post-truth era, an age of alternative facts, whatever that's supposed to mean. This has been brewing for a long time now in America and has reached full force with the onset of social media that provides a broadcast platform to anyone with a computer, a cell phone, and an opinion. What has become increasingly clear since the 2020 pandemic and the 2020 election is that we've reached a crisis point. We've become all too willing as a society to accept as truth exaggeration, misrepresentations of fact, and even sheer delusion. Resting comfortably within our echo chambers, we label what we don't wish to hear as fake. We call those communicators who challenge our vision of reality or our version of reality enemies of the people. Pontius Pilate, that great equivocator, asks in the New Testament, what is truth? Those of us who spend our careers searching after the truth know what truth is. Truth is observable. It's quantifiable. It's reality-based. But there is also a truth that is beyond the observable and the quantifiable. And that is the truth that is perhaps invisible to the eye, seen only with the heart, to quote the wise fox in Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's The Little Prince. This is the truth we encounter in the deepest, most intimate part of our being, in that part of ourselves that is most decent, most compassionate, and most in touch with the sacred. You might call this essential truth. It is the truth found in so many of the stories of women religious. If ever I'm feeling despair, I know I can call up the latest stories in Global Sisters Report and outlets like it, and immediately my mood changes. I'm heartened every time I read about the courage of religious sisters in Ukraine, opening their doors to people affected by that tragic war, and by the many efforts of our US sisters to support them, along with the important work that our African sisters have done to correct misinformation and hesitancy about COVID vaccines. When the faith history of this era is written, surely the nuns and nuns' effort will rank as one of the most significant spiritual developments. A few times in recent years, I've been invited onto Zoom calls between Catholic sisters and these young seekers. I don't know why I've been invited since I'm neither a Catholic sister nor a young nun. Nonetheless, I've been grateful to hear how eager these young adults are to live more contemplative lives, to build community, to work for justice, and to seek consensus among those who disagree. There was an important and wonderful article recently in Global Sisters Report by Soli Salgado about the Nuns and Nuns Land Justice Project. Through this effort, young people are helping women religious find new purposes for their excess land and oversized buildings. These are efforts as well to foster care for creation and also open opportunities for groups that have historically been denied land and property ownership. Another of my favorite sources for news is the Catholic Worker newspaper, still going strong after 89 years and still being sold for a penny an issue. The paper recently published an excellent reflection on the Supreme Court's decision overturning Roe v. Wade. The author of the article was a woman who had experienced an unplanned pregnancy at the age of 19 that interrupted her college education. She chose to give birth to her child, but she also wrote with compassion of other young women she knew who faced the same choice, who did not have the support that she had, who felt they had to end their pregnancies. What struck me was the writer's ability to have empathy for those who felt they had to make a different choice. There are other difficult stories that must be told. For example, we must not stop writing about the number of African sisters attacked or killed in their homelands. An investigation is now underway for the first time to give a full accounting of local sisters whose deaths and attacks in their own countries so often go unreported. These are just a few of the many stories that reach beyond what Thomas Merton called the shadow and the disguise, so prevalent in our culture. These are the stories that go beyond the news. They are stories about what is essential, and they are yours to make known. Now, I know a problem we all face is a shrinking media landscape. The media contraction, however, is also an opportunity for religious communicators, in my view. There now exist many other venues besides traditional media in which to tell your stories, and to tell them in ways you want these stories to be told. Many of you are already doing a marvelous job at this through podcasts like Sister Julia Walsh's Messy Jesus Business, through websites and e-magazines like The Good Oil, put out by the Good Samaritan Benedictine Sisters, the Good Samaritan Benedictine Sisters of Australia. And you are doing this through online newsletters, webinars, and panel discussions online, through Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and even TikTok. Now, I'm no great fan of social media. It can be a big time waster. But I have to say, I love all the nun stuff that I see on Instagram. And often when I go on social media, I find a link to a spirituality article or an interview that does spark my interest. So I would urge you to keep using these venues to put out untold and undertold stories like the ones I've mentioned. And also stories that counter conventional wisdom, stories about surprising or non-traditional ministries. The question arises, how do we keep uncovering these stories? I mentioned the importance of careful listening, listening with the ear of the heart. I want to suggest two other important practices. One is to be a creative questioner, and just as importantly, having the courage to become what the behaviorist Margaret Wheatley calls a warrior for the human spirit. A warrior for the human spirit. First, on being a creative questioner. There is a wonderful book by a former journalist named Warren Berger called A More Beautiful Question. The title comes from this line from an E.E. Cummings poem: "Always the beautiful answer who asks a more beautiful question." Berger says every problem that presents itself is an opportunity if we pose the right questions. As we explore an issue or an event, Berger suggests we ask ourselves the questions, what if and how might we? What if and how might we? As communicators, he suggests we first of all take a step back and look for what others might be missing. He asks us to challenge all assumptions, including our own, and then to question the question we're asking. This is a way of embracing what the Buddhists call Soshin, or beginner's mind. The mind of the beginner, Berger writes, is free of the habits of an expert. It is thus open to all possibilities, but can still see things as they are. There is a great deal of wisdom in that for those of us who would be sowers of the word. Finally, I'd like to speak a bit about an idea that comes from Margaret Wheatley. Margaret Wheatley has written extensively on creativity and leadership. You might recall how Joseph Campbell, the great scholar of mythology, talks about the hero with 1,000 faces. Wheatley says the heroes of the 21st century will be what she calls warriors for the human spirit. These warriors are awake human beings, Wheatley says. You will know them by their compassionate presence. Warriors for the human spirit refrain from using fear and aggression to accomplish their ends. They seek to create islands of sanity. They do their work with patience, clear-sightedness, and compassion. When the most marginalized in society are under threat, they do not try to manipulate a system for their own benefit or distract attention from the suffering of others. Instead, they maintain a positive attitude, cultivate a sense of humor, and seek out moments of joy and grace. Does that not describe our women religious? Are those not the goals we might set for ourselves as religious communicators? This, of course, carries with it responsibility and risk. For religious communicators, it means having the courage to speak out when our faith leaders and fellow believers do not follow the values and principles we purport to profess. And we need to be honest when our religious leaders and fellow believers contribute to creating divisions rather than seeking common ground. We need to advocate for moral leadership in every sense, not giving a pass to ethically flawed leaders simply because we like their positions on a few high-profile issues. All this is to say that as marvelous as the work is that we do, there is still a great deal of important work ahead. I started out by quoting Mary Oliver, who said her work is loving the world. In our work, there are many untold stories waiting for us to tell them. There are beautiful questions to ask. There are possibilities and perspectives we have yet to uncover. It is a large task, but recalling the words of the Mary Oliver poem with which I began, if you have not been enchanted by this adventure, what would do for you? What would do for you? I hope these few thoughts I've shared might spur some fresh reflection on your mission. I urge you too to remember the advice Thomas Merton famously gave to the journalist, author, and peace activist Jim Forrest when Jim had hit a low point in his work. Merton wrote, "Do not depend on the hope of results. When you are doing the sort of work you have taken on, essentially an apostolic work, you may have to face the fact that your work will achieve no result at all, if not perhaps results opposite to what you expect. Concentrate not on the results, but on the value, the rightness, the truth of the work itself. The real hope, then, is not in something we think we can do, but in God, who is making something good out of it in some way we perhaps cannot see." I'd like to leave you now with another beloved Oliver poem, a lovely little poem of just a few lines. May it send us forth on our mission of loving the world. I go down to the shore. I go down to the shore in the morning, and depending on the hour, the waves are rolling in or moving out. And I say, oh, I am miserable. What should I do? And the sea says in its lovely voice, excuse me, I have work to do. Thank you for your kind attention this afternoon, and thanks be to God.
Because Judy is not able to be here to take questions, she sent us questions. These are questions that Judy sent for table discussion. I think we have a little less than 10 minutes. Am I correct? A little less than 10 minutes before the next event. So go ahead and choose a question or two and discuss at your table. And when it's time for the next event, someone will appear here. Thank you.